the gate, talking into his radio in short, clipped sentences. He was already requesting a full incident report from the station, and I could hear him asking dispatch to pull any past complaints from the HOA involving Karen. The younger trooper, Rix, paced the driveway with his notepad, checking details and interviewing witnesses. Pete was more than happy to give his statement, describing the entire event down to the angle of Karen's high heel when she kicked. I couldn't help but crack a smile as Pete mimicked Karen's voice, fluttering his hands and pretending to wave a clipboard like a magic wand. I stepped into the barn office to grab the rest of the documentation, old surveys, aerial images, even a copy of a letter from the county clerk confirming our exemption from HOA oversight. It was all organized in a battered green folder I had kept since the day we bought the land. It had never seemed that important until today. As I handed the folder to Jalen, I noticed the way his expression shifted. He knew. He understood that what Karen had done wasn't just a nuisance or a mistake. It was premeditated trespassing, made worse by assault, and it had been done with full confidence that she would get away with it. Jalen flipped through the folder slowly. He paused on the aerial map, tapped the legend with his pen, then pointed to the faded yellow line that marked the edge of HOA control. It was over 200 feet from our barn gate. That distance might as well have been a mile, legally speaking. He asked me if Karen had ever confronted us before. I told him no, not directly, but she had left printed HOA warnings in our mailbox more than once. She had complained about the sound of the rooster, the placement of our compost pile, and once accused us of lowering property values because our barn roof wasn't painted beige. But we had always ignored her. We figured she'd get bored. Clearly, we were wrong. Outside, Rix was wrapping up with the neighbors. A few of them stayed to help put away fallen flower pots and refill the animal water troughs that had been knocked over in the scuffle. Even the teenagers with the dirt bikes helped straighten the gate and sweep up spilled feed. Small town kindness. That was the reason we moved here. That and the space. The quiet. The hope of raising a child somewhere that felt untouched by the world's chaos. Karen had cracked that hope for a moment, but as I watched these people step in without being asked, I realized she hadn't broken it. If anything, she'd reinforced it. Then, like a bad rerun, Karen's voice returned. Distant at first. She wasn't on our land this time, but close enough to be heard. She had set up camp near the edge of the road, right at the end of the HOA border. From there, she held up a sign. At first I thought it said something about private property. Then I saw the full message. It was handwritten in black marker across a foam board and read, "Caution, aggressive farm people ahead. Do not engage." Jalen saw it too. He didn't say anything, just shook his head and sighed. Then he walked to the edge of our property and called out to her. "Ma'am, I strongly advise you to stop antagonizing these residents. This is not helping your situation." Karen just waved her clipboard and shouted back something about free speech and neighborhood preservation. Rix looked at Jalen and quietly asked if she was okay mentally. Jalen didn't answer, but his silence said enough. As the troopers prepared to leave, Jalen pulled me aside. He told me he'd be recommending an emergency restraining order to the county judge and that an officer would check in periodically over the next few days. He also asked if I wanted to press formal charges. I looked at Sarah, who was now inside resting on the couch with her feet up and a warm blanket over her legs. She was sipping tea and watching the goats through the window. Her strength amazed me. I nodded to Jalen. "Yes, we're pressing charges." Before they left, Rix handed me a small voice recorder and said they'd appreciate it if I kept track of any further interactions with Karen, no matter how small. I agreed. I had a feeling we'd need it. As their SUV pulled away, kicking up a soft trail of dust, I stood by the gate and looked toward the road. Karen was still standing there with her ridiculous sign, but now she was on a phone call, pacing in tight circles like a dog tethered too close to a tree. I went back inside. Sarah smiled when she saw me and reached for my hand. She asked how it ended. I told her the troopers were handling it. She didn't ask for details. She didn't have to. She knew this wasn't over. But she also knew we weren't alone anymore. Later that evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of orange and the crickets began their nightly chorus, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea. The barn lights flicked on automatically, casting a soft glow across the field. I heard the goats settling down and the wind moving through the tall grass. Everything looked normal, peaceful. But I felt a change in the air. Karen's stunt had triggered something bigger than she anticipated. I had spent years enforcing laws, breaking up fights, dealing with the worst sides of people. But nothing ever felt as personal as today. This wasn't just about land or boundaries, or even the kick. It was about the kind of world we wanted to raise our child in. A world where bullies in boardrooms and clipboards didn't get to write the rules for everyone else. I looked out over the field, toward the dark edge of the HOA property line. Karen was gone now. Maybe just for the night. But I had no doubt she'd be back. And next time I'd be ready. Not with force. Not with anger. But with truth. With law. With neighbors who cared more about right than rules. The kind of quiet strength you don't need to shout about. The kind of strength Sarah had shown without saying a word. The next morning, the sun rose without drama, spilling golden light across the pasture and through the barn windows as if trying to pretend the day before had never happened. But no amount of sunshine could erase the memory of Karen's kick or the wild-eyed look she wore as she screamed legal nonsense from our gate. I had barely sipped my coffee when I saw her again. This time, she was in different clothes. She wore a beige windbreaker with a fake-looking badge clipped to the collar and aviator sunglasses that were far too large for her face. In one hand she held her clipboard again, but now it had a printed sheet on top with bold letters that read Community Environmental Safety Patrol. I stared at her through the kitchen window. Sarah was still asleep on the couch, her hand gently resting on her belly. I didn't want her to wake up to more of this. Karen didn't step onto the property this time, at least not yet. She stayed just outside the boundary line, standing near the drainage ditch that ran along the gravel path. From there, she began filming again. Her voice echoed through the quiet morning as she gave some bizarre monologue about unregulated animal waste, illegal compost piles, and threats to the HOA ecosystem. I walked outside calmly and stood by the gate, not saying anything at first. She pointed her phone at me and called me the suspect in an ongoing disturbance investigation. I almost laughed. I asked her plainly what she was doing. She puffed out her chest and said she was gathering evidence for the HOA's newly established Rural Oversight Task Force. I told her to step back 5 feet because she was still standing on the edge of my land, and I had clear documentation to prove it. She argued that the property line was disputed, which was a lie, and then accused me of contaminating HOA grounds with airborne pollen from our wildflowers. That was a new one. I let her talk. I had turned on the small voice recorder Trooper Ricks gave me and slipped it in my pocket. Everything she said, every baseless claim, every accusation was now being preserved. Suddenly, Karen darted forward, not onto the property but toward the goat pen fence. She shouted something about unauthorized livestock proximity to a shared border. She raised her clipboard as if preparing to take photos or start measuring the distance between the fence and her sidewalk. As she leaned over the edge, one of our goats, an ornery billy named Captain, took interest. Captain was known for 2 things. 1, eating anything that looked remotely like paper. 2, not appreciating people who got too close without treat. Karen, of course, had paper. She had a whole clipboard full of it. Captain trotted over with his usual sideways head bob, gave one good sniff, and then in a flash, chomped down on the corner of her top sheet. Karen shrieked. She stumbled back, yanked her clipboard upward, and in doing so, lost her balance. Her foot slipped on a patch of damp grass near the ditch. Down she went, feet in the air, clipboard flying, phone skidding across the gravel. It was all so fast and yet so slow. She landed squarely in the muddy ditch water with a splash that sent 2 frogs leaping in opposite directions. I covered my mouth, not in shock but in an attempt to stop myself from laughing. Pete, who had come by to check on the fencing, saw the whole thing and let out a wheezy chuckle from across the pasture. Karen sputtered, tried to get up, slipped again, and finally managed to crawl to the edge, soaked and humiliated. Her sunglasses were missing. Her windbreaker was coated in brownish-green muck. Captain stared at her, chewing the corner of her paper like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Karen didn't yell this time. She didn't make a scene. She just scrambled to her feet, grabbed her soggy clipboard and muddy phone, and limped off toward the HOA road without a word. I stood there, stunned by the silence. No threat, no lawsuit. Just the sound of squishing shoes and one very confused goat. Pete walked up beside me and muttered that he wished he'd filmed it. I told him not to worry. The voice recorder had caught the audio, and the goats were probably better witnesses than any human could be. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Trooper Jalen. He said the county judge had approved the temporary restraining order and that a formal court date would be set within the next 10 days. Karen would be served papers by the end of the evening. He also told me he'd spoken to several neighbors who had submitted written complaints about Karen's behavior over the past year. Apparently, she had been keeping files on at least 6 other households. One neighbor was fined for planting tomatoes in their front yard. Another was cited for having a blue picnic table. It was clear now that Karen had appointed herself as some sort of enforcer without any real authority. When Sarah woke up, I told her everything. She laughed harder than I had heard her laugh in weeks. When I described how Captain had chomped down on the clipboard and sent Karen flying into the ditch, she held her belly and said the baby kicked from joy. She asked if I was sure the goat didn't plan it. I told her if he did, he deserved a medal. As evening came, the air turned cooler. The troopers returned briefly to deliver the restraining order. They posted a copy near the gate and took photos for documentation. Karen was not seen again that day. I figured she was licking her wounds somewhere, maybe soaking in a tub and plotting her next dramatic return. I doubted it would be her last visit, but I felt better knowing the law was on our side now in writing. The quiet returned slowly. First, the goats resumed their usual games of butting heads near the water trough. Then the chickens came out to peck at the grass near the porch. Sarah and I sat together in the rocking chairs, sipping lemonade and watching the sky melt into orange. We talked about baby names. She liked Rose. I liked June. We both agreed that whatever name we chose, it should mean strength. Not revenge. Not pride. But resilience. The kind of strength that stays quiet until needed, the kind that holds the line and never bows to bullying. Out in the field, Captain stood tall, still chewing the last shred of Karen's clipboard. I raised my glass to him. That goat had done more for neighborhood justice than any committee meeting ever had. We didn't know what Karen would try next. But we knew this much. She had finally met her match. Not in me. Not even in the law. But in a muddy ditch, at the feet of a goat, surrounded by people who were no longer willing to let her terrorize their peace. The courthouse was small, the kind of building that smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee, tucked between the town's post office and the hardware store. I had been there a handful of times in my life, mostly to get permits or pay taxes, never to press charges. But now, sitting on the wooden bench outside the courtroom doors with Sarah beside me and our lawyer reviewing documents, it felt different. It felt like the quiet before a storm we didn't ask for but had no choice but to face. Sarah wore a soft blue dress and held her belly gently with both hands. She looked calm, but I could feel the tension in the way her thumb rubbed slow circles along the side of her hand. The courtroom door opened with a creak, and we were called inside. Karen was already seated at the defendant's table, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She wore a neck brace, a black dress, and an expression that could only be described as forced fragility. The moment she saw Sarah, she looked away, as if the sight of a woman she had kicked was too much even for her to perform around. The judge entered and everyone stood. Judge Pickett was old school, sharp-eyed, and known for having no patience for nonsense.